It was supposed to be a new beginning. My wife, Anna, and I had just gotten married and were ready to start our life together. We found this apartment in a cozy little neighborhood, not too far from the city, but quiet enough to hear the crickets at night. It was a charming place, with exposed brick walls in the living room and a tiny balcony that overlooked a park filled with old, twisted oak trees. We were so excited to paint the walls, choose furniture, and make it our own. We were young, broke, and madly in love. The kind of love that made even a tiny, slightly run-down apartment feel like a palace. I was working as a freelance graphic designer, and Anna was a baker at a local cafe, her hands always smelling faintly of cinnamon and sugar. Life was simple, blissful. We spent our days laughing, dreaming, and planning our future. Little did we know, our future was about to be defined by a series of knocks, a bizarre rhythm that would invade our peace and turn our dream home into a living nightmare. It started subtly, a barely perceptible sound in the dead of night, that it was exactly 3 a.m. the first time we heard it. I was a night owl back then, often staying up late finishing client work. Anna was a deep sleeper, but the noise was enough to stir her. It was a faint, repetitive tapping, a soft thump-thump-thump coming from the wall that separated our bedroom from our neighbors. At first, we just figured it was a water pipe, or maybe our neighbor, an old man named Mr. Henderson, was just a restless sleeper. He was a peculiar character, a retired history professor who wore thick glasses and a perpetual frown. He was always friendly enough, but he seemed like the type who lived a very structured life. The next morning, we brought it up to him, a bit embarrassed, and he just squinted at us over his glasses. "Knocking?" he asked, his voice raspy. From my side, "I've been hearing it too. Drives me crazy. It wakes me up, and I swear it's coming from your side." He looked genuinely frustrated, and a chill went down my spine. The idea that we were all hearing the same phantom noise, and that neither of us was the cause, was deeply unsettling. The knocking became a nightly ritual, a clockwork occurrence that we could set our watches to. Every night, without fail, at 3 a.m. on the dot. It was always 3 simple, rhythmic knocks, like a polite but insistent person waiting for you to answer the door. It was the kind of thing you try to ignore, but once you hear it, it's all you can focus on. And we would lie there, in the dark, our hearts pounding in sync with the sound, wondering what on earth was on the other side. The simple knocks soon evolved. It wasn't just a basic rhythm anymore. It was like the person on the other side of the wall was trying to get our attention in a more deliberate way. The 3 knocks at 3 a.m. were just the beginning. A few nights later, they came again, but this time, there was a pause, a moment of silence, followed by 2 quick taps. Then another pause, and 2 more taps. We lay in bed, our eyes wide in the pitch-black room, clutching each other, a silent agreement not to speak, not to make a sound. We were terrified, but also morbidly curious. What was this? Was it a person? A prank? The pattern repeated itself every night, becoming more and more complex. It wasn't just random sounds anymore. It was an intelligent sequence, like a code. The rhythm became so familiar we could almost anticipate the next tap. Anna, with her baker's mind, a mind that dealt in precise measurements and delicate timings, was the first to realize it wasn't just a pattern. She started tapping it out on my arm one night, a sequence of long and short taps, like Morse code. I remember the goosebumps on my skin as she did it. One morning, we decided to take a more proactive approach. We bought a small, cheap microphone and a pair of headphones. We taped the microphone to the wall right where the knocks were the loudest, ran the cable to my laptop, and hit record. We figured we could analyze the sound waves and try to find a pattern that way. That night, at 3 a.m., the knocks came. We both sat up in bed, listening to the muffled taps through the headphones. I hit a button on the laptop, and the audio waveform appeared on the screen, a jagged line that mirrored the knocks perfectly. Anna's eyes were glued to the screen, her brow furrowed in concentration. She looked at the sequence of peaks and valleys, a mix of long and short waves, and a gasp escaped her lips. "It's not just Morse code," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's spelling something out. It's too rhythmic to be anything else." We spent the rest of the night and the entire following day decoding the message. It was a painstaking, terrifying process. We'd write down the series of long and short taps, convert them to letters, and then try to put the letters together to form words. It was like trying to solve a puzzle, but with the chilling realization that the puzzle was trying to communicate with us. It was a language spoken through the walls that it took us a full day and a sleepless night, but we finally got it. We had decoded the message. It was a single, three-word phrase, spelled out with painstaking clarity. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the pen as I wrote it down. My wife was sitting beside me, pale as a ghost, her eyes fixed on the notepad. The message, scrawled in my messy handwriting, was a cold, cruel punch to the gut. Open the wall. The letters were a jagged, terrifying mess on the paper, and the silence in our apartment felt heavier than ever before. We just stared at the words, at a loss for words ourselves. Who was on the other side of that wall? What did they want? The thought of an actual person being trapped inside a wall, right next to our bed, was a horrifying mix of disbelief and sheer terror. We tried to rationalize it. A prank, a sick joke, but the rhythmic, deliberate nature of the knocks, the fact that they'd been going on for weeks, made it impossible to dismiss. This was a desperate plea, not a game. Our sense of security completely evaporated. We stopped sleeping in our bedroom. We moved our mattress to the living room, a futile attempt to put distance between ourselves and whatever was on the other side of that drywall. But the knocks followed us. A few nights later, we were huddled together on the couch, half asleep, when the familiar thump-thump-thump started again. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the bedroom wall. It was coming from the kitchen wall, then the hallway, and then, most horrifyingly, from the wall right beside the couch we were sleeping on. The knocks were no longer confined to the shared wall with our neighbor. They were inside our apartment. It was as if the presence had learned to travel, to mimic its source, to get closer to us. The knocks weren't just a communication anymore. They were a presence, and they were now everywhere. The plea of "open the wall" seemed to echo from every corner, every piece of plaster and wood. It was an impossible request, a command from something that had broken the rules of reality and was now demanding entry. We were trapped in our own home, terrorized by a voice with no body, a sound with no source. The terror wasn't just in the sound anymore. It was in the location. The knocks were now a taunt, a game of cat and mouse. They would start in the bedroom, a familiar rhythm, and just as we were about to rush out, a single, sharp knock would sound from the opposite end of the apartment, near the front door. We'd freeze, listening, and then another series of knocks would come from the kitchen, louder and more insistent than before. It was as if this thing was moving through the very structure of the building, flowing like a dark liquid behind the plaster. We would sit on our couch, huddled under a blanket, clutching each other, our heads darting from wall to wall, trying to pinpoint the next source. The knocks weren't just Morse code anymore. They were getting more aggressive, more frantic. The "open the wall" had been a plea. Now, the new messages were commands, warnings. They were shorter, sharper. "We're here." And then a series of quick, deliberate taps that spelled out my name, Mark. The sound of my own name, a name that had always been a source of comfort, now sounded like a death sentence tapped out in the night. It felt like we were being stalked, our home transformed into a cage with no lock. Desperation led us to do something completely irrational. In broad daylight, with the sun streaming through the windows, we got a hammer from the utility closet and stood in the middle of our living room. My hands were shaking. "We have to do something," Anna whispered, her eyes wide and red from lack of sleep. "We have to find out what's on the other side." I remember standing there, hammer in hand, a strange mix of bravery and complete insanity coursing through me. I raised the hammer and brought it down on the living room wall, right where we had heard the last series of knocks. The drywall splintered with a sickening crunch. A cloud of plaster dust filled the air, and we both leaned in, peering into the dark space between the studs. There was nothing, just insulation, wires, and empty space. No cavity, no person, no hidden room. It was just a normal wall. We repeated this process in the bedroom, the kitchen, everywhere the knocks had come from. Each time, the result was the same: nothing. We spent a small fortune on a contractor to fix the holes, a man with a weathered face who just shook his head and said he'd never seen anything like it. "It's a beautiful old building," he mumbled, "but it's got a few strange quirks, I guess." We were left with nothing but gaping holes in our walls and the terrifying knowledge that the source of the knocks wasn't in the walls. It was part of the walls themselves. Or something much worse. The silent frustration from the walls was palpable. After our failed attempts to find a rational explanation, the knocking stopped for a single night, a moment of deceptive calm. The next evening, however, it returned with a sickening twist. The first knock wasn't a tap, but a deliberate scrape, like a fingernail dragging slowly down a blackboard. Then another, this time sounding exactly like Anna's gentle sigh. I remember my blood running cold as I heard it, the perfect, chilling mimicry of her own sigh, a sound I had heard 1,000 times. The sound wasn't just in the walls anymore. It was now a replica of us, a hollow echo of our lives. It began to copy the sounds of our apartment, the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the low whisper of our conversations. One night, Anna, exhausted and tearful, whispered to me, "I can't take this anymore, Mark. I feel like it's listening to us." A moment later, a series of quick, sharp knocks from the bedroom wall tapped out the words, "I hear you." The sound was so loud, so direct, that Anna screamed, her face buried in my chest. The feeling of being listened to, of being watched by something inside the very structure of our home, was an invisible, suffocating weight. It wasn't just asking us to open the wall anymore. It was telling us it was already inside. That was the breaking point. We couldn't live like this. The next morning, we started packing, throwing our clothes and a few essentials into suitcases, not caring about the furniture or the boxes of memories. Every bag we packed felt like a weight being lifted. We just wanted out. As the sun began to set, casting long, menacing shadows across our living room, the knocks began. It wasn't 3 a.m. yet, but the rhythm was a frenzied, desperate staccato. Bang, bang, bang. The knocks weren't polite anymore. They were violent, a frantic pounding from every single wall at once. The entire apartment seemed to vibrate. My coffee cup slid off the table and shattered on the floor. A picture frame fell from the wall, its glass cracking. It was a tantrum, an enraged protest from whatever malevolent force had taken residence. The walls themselves seemed to be screaming at us not to leave, but we didn't stop. With shaking hands, we zipped up our last bag. The knocks grew deafening, an unholy cacophony of sound. We grabbed our keys and ran for the door, leaving everything else behind. As we stumbled down the hallway and slammed the front door shut, the pounding was still audible, a ghostly, furious echo from the other side. We didn't look back. We didn't even say goodbye to Mr. Henderson. We just drove until the sun came up, leaving the apartment, the knocks, and our entire life there in the rearview mirror. But sometimes, late at night, in a quiet moment, I swear I can still hear a faint tapping from a distant wall that we found a small house outside the city, a detached place with a big yard and no shared walls. Our new home was a haven, a place to heal, but the trauma lingered. Anna became a shell of her former self, and I couldn't sleep through the night without the aid of a sleeping pill. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows would send a jolt of panic through us. We tried to talk about it, but the words felt empty, ridiculous. Who would believe us? We just agreed to never mention it again. We never told our families why we moved so suddenly, or why we left everything behind. We tried to convince ourselves it was just a strange occurrence, a trick of the mind brought on by stress. But every once in a while, in the quiet of the night, when I'm alone in the living room, a distant memory of a sound returns, faint and insistent, a polite but terrifying request. We never saw Mr. Henderson again. He was the only one who might have understood. He was the only other victim, and I often wonder if he, too, managed to escape or if he eventually gave in to the endless knocking, opening a wall to a world he couldn't possibly comprehend. Life eventually settled into a new normal. We learned to live with our jumpiness, with the unspoken fear that lived in the corners of our home and our minds. One day, a few months after we'd moved in, Anna wanted to hang a new picture above our bed, a wedding photo. It was supposed to be a symbol of our new beginning, a final farewell to the past. I grabbed my drill, carefully measured the spot, and pressed the trigger. The drill bit began to whir, a steady, rhythmic buzz that hummed against the drywall. Suddenly, my heart dropped into my stomach. It was a familiar sound, the same cadence, the same insistent rhythm. I pulled the drill away, my hand trembling. Silence. I put the drill back against the wall, and the sound returned, a perfectly replicated thump, thump, thump. My blood ran cold. The sound wasn't in the wall. It was in the drill itself. It had been there the whole time, a piece of that nightmare that we brought with us, a ghost that would follow us forever, waiting to be unleashed again. We sold the house within the year and never used a drill again. The knocks never returned, but the silence, the utter and absolute lack of any sound, feels more terrifying than any rhythm could ever be. Because now, we know it's just waiting for the next sign, for us to finally open the wall. So, I've been a lurker on this forum for a while, just reading everyone's insane stories, but I never thought I'd have something to contribute myself. This happened a few years back, when I was fresh out of college and had just moved into my first apartment all on my own. It was this perfect little two-bedroom place in a quiet, older neighborhood, full of these charming Victorian-style houses with big porches. My life back then was pretty simple and predictable. I had a job at a small marketing firm, spent my evenings binging TV shows or trying new recipes, and my biggest worry was whether I could get my cat, Jasper, to stop tearing up the couch. It was the kind of life you'd see in a cozy indie film, all peace and quiet, and I loved every minute of it. The whole neighborhood had this sense of sleepy stillness that made me feel so safe, so much so that I never even bothered to lock the patio door, which in hindsight is just, well, you'll see. It all started with this one tiny detail that I barely noticed at first. My bedroom was in the front of the apartment, and my window faced directly across the street. The house over there was this big, old two-story with a wraparound porch, and it always seemed a little run down, with peeling paint and overgrown bushes. It was home to this guy I only ever saw from a distance. I never knew his name, but he was a fixture of the block. What struck me as odd was that his bedroom window, the one directly across from mine, was never, ever closed. Not in the blazing summer heat, not in the crisp autumn air. And he was always in there, in the window. I'm not talking about him sitting and reading, or working on a laptop, or even just looking out at the street. He was just standing, motionless. He was this tall, lanky figure, with these wide shoulders that made him look like a scarecrow in the dim light. His face was always a blurry shadow from my distance, but I could feel his presence, this constant, unblinking stillness that was almost a physical weight. It was strange, but at first, I just chalked it up to him being an eccentric old guy. People have their quirks, right? I tried to ignore it, to focus on my own little world. But soon, that stillness began to feel like it was watching me, like it was waiting. The little things started to pile up, turning a vague sense of unease into a gnawing certainty. I'd be in the kitchen, washing dishes, and I'd catch a fleeting shadow in my peripheral vision, a movement from across the street. I'd look up, and he'd be there, his head ever so slightly tilted, like a robin listening for a worm, following my movements as I walked from the sink to the fridge. I started doing little experiments. I'd purposefully walk from the living room to my bedroom, a path that led past my front window, and I'd feel his gaze tracking me the whole way. I'd glance out of my bedroom window just before turning off the lights at night, and he would be a dark, unmoving silhouette, a black hole against the faint streetlights, just standing there in the inky blackness. I'd go to bed, but the feeling of being watched was so intense that I'd get up an hour later, heart pounding, and creep to the window to peek through a tiny gap in the blinds. Every single time, without fail, he was there, a sentinel of silent dread, still as death itself. The real horror, the kind that steals your breath and makes your skin crawl, began one morning when I went to get the mail. I remember it was a Tuesday, a perfectly sunny day, and I was in this blissfully unaware state, humming a song as I walked down the hall. But there was no mail in my box. Instead, a single, folded piece of paper lay on the floor just inside my front door. No envelope, no stamp, just a stark white rectangle. My stomach dropped. I picked it up, my hands trembling a little, and unfolded it. The words inside were scrawled in an almost childlike handwriting, uneven and wobbly. It didn't threaten me. It didn't ask for anything. It just said, "The blue dress with the white flowers looked lovely on you last night." I froze, the paper crinkling in my hand. I had been wearing that exact dress the previous evening while I was cooking dinner. I hadn't gone outside. I hadn't had any visitors. The only person who could have known that was the person who was watching my every move. The paper felt like a poison in my hand, a silent confirmation that he wasn't just a weird guy across the street anymore. He was a predator who had somehow, impossibly, breached the security of my home. My little safe haven was gone. The letter turned my apartment, my sanctuary, into a cage. I spent the rest of that day huddled on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the front door. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the window, sounded like a footstep. I couldn't bring myself to look outside, to check if he was still there, but I didn't have to. I could feel his eyes on me, even through the curtains, a constant pressure that made my skin prickle with cold. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? A guy across the street stares at me, and a weird, unsigned note showed up under my door. It sounded insane, like the kind of thing they'd file away as a neighborhood dispute. They'd tell me to get a restraining order, and I'd be left with a piece of paper that couldn't protect me from a phantom. The thought of them questioning him, of him knowing I'd called them, was even more terrifying than the thought of him continuing to watch me in silence that I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. My mind was a terrifying kaleidoscope of every single moment I had been in my home, wondering if he had been watching me then. Had he seen me crying on the floor after a bad day? Had he seen me dancing stupidly to an old song? The thought of my most vulnerable, private moments being observed was a violation that cut deeper than I could have imagined. By the next morning, I was a wreck, pale and shaking. The fear had curdled into a desperate rage. I was so tired of feeling like a mouse in a glass cage, so sick of being a character in his silent, twisted play. I needed to see his face up close, to hear his voice, to understand what kind of person did this. Maybe I could shame him into stopping. Maybe I could get him to say something I could record, something the police would finally take seriously. It was a stupid, reckless plan born out of pure desperation, but at that moment, it felt like the only way to get my life back. So I put on a brave face, grabbed my phone, and walked out the door. But I remember the walk across the street like it was a slow-motion movie. The sidewalk felt impossibly long, and the distance between my door and his felt like a chasm. The air was a crisp, cold slap to my face, and my heart was doing this frantic, hummingbird flutter in my chest. Up close, his house was even more decrepit, the peeling paint a blistered skin on the side of a rotting corpse. The bushes were tangled, dark claws reaching for the porch, and the whole place smelled like damp earth and neglect. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my shaking hands, and walked up the 3 creaky steps to his front door. My finger hovered over the doorbell for what felt like an eternity before I finally pressed it. The sound it made was a hollow, discordant chime, like a cracked bell in an old church, and I instantly wanted to run back home and bury myself under my blankets. There was no sound from inside, just the deafening roar of my own blood in my ears. The door finally opened, not with a creak or a slam, but with a silent, deliberate glide. And there he was. He was taller than I thought, a gaunt man with a pale, sallow complexion and a strange, almost unnatural stillness about him. His hair was thin and wispy, and his eyes, they were the most disturbing part. They weren't a specific color, just a flat, lifeless gray, like pebbles at the bottom of a riverbed. He didn't speak. He didn't blink. He just stared at me with the same blank, unwavering gaze he'd used from across the street. The silence was heavy and suffocating. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but the words got caught in my throat. I had to physically force myself to step forward and push past him, and he didn't resist. He just stood there, a human statue, as I stumbled into the dark, musty air of his apartment. The apartment was shockingly sparse. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of dust, and something metallic I couldn't place. My eyes were still adjusting to the dim light when I saw them. At first, I thought they were just paintings, or maybe something he collected. They covered the entire wall in front of me, arranged in messy, overlapping rows. But as my eyes focused, my blood ran cold. They weren't paintings. They were photos. Dozens of them. Hundreds. And every single one was of me. There was me walking down my street, me getting groceries out of my car, me on my porch talking on the phone. They were all taken from his window across the street, capturing every mundane, unremarkable moment of my life, turning it into something grotesque and horrifying. My stomach lurched, a hot wave of nausea washing over me as I started to grasp the full extent of his obsession, but then I saw the others. My eyes darted to the photos on the wall next to me, and my breath hitched in my throat. These weren't taken from across the street. The angles were wrong, impossible. There was a photo of me, sitting on my couch, reading a book. The shot was clearly taken from my hallway. Another photo was of me washing dishes in my kitchen, a perfect, chilling profile shot from a point just beyond my door frame. The worst of all was one of me sleeping in my bed, the picture blurry but undeniably me. The shot taken from my closet, the door barely ajar. The realization hit me like a physical blow, a rush of cold fire spreading through my veins. He wasn't just a creeper with a camera across the street. He had been in my apartment. He had been in my home, with my things, while I was sleeping. He had invaded my most sacred, private spaces. The silent scream tore through my lungs. I felt like I was drowning in the stale air of his apartment, the photos of me, of my life, closing in like the walls of a coffin. My feet felt leaden, my entire body paralyzed by the sheer, unholy magnitude of the violation. He had been there, in my home, breathing the same air I did, watching me from the darkness. The thought was like a hand around my throat. I tore my eyes away from the wall and looked at him, the man who had done this. He was still standing there, motionless, his lifeless eyes staring right through me. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. He knew I had seen everything. My body reacted before my mind did, and I bolted. I didn't run. I fled, my legs moving faster than they ever had. A panicked, desperate flight back to the illusion of safety. I didn't look back until I was in my car, my hands fumbling with the keys, my body shaking with a deep, bone-rattling cold that I didn't go inside my apartment. I couldn't. I drove to the nearest gas station and called the police, my voice a broken, trembling mess as I tried to explain what I had just seen. They took me seriously, thankfully, and within an hour, squad cars were swarming the quiet street. They went into his house, and they found it all. The photos, the weird letter, everything. But when they came out, the officer told me they couldn't find the man himself. He had simply vanished. They checked the entire house, even the basement and attic, but he was gone, leaving behind only the evidence of his obsession. I never saw him again, and I never moved back into that apartment. My parents helped me pack what I could, but every box felt tainted. To this day, the sight of a half-open window across the street, even in a different city, makes my heart leap into my throat. The feeling of being watched, of my private moments being on display for some hidden observer, never really went away. That sense of safety I had, the feeling of a home being my sanctuary, it's something I don't think I'll ever truly get back. This all went down about 3 years ago, when I was finally moving out of my parents' place. I'd just turned 21, and I'd saved up enough from my part-time job at a coffee shop to rent my first ever apartment on my own. It was a big deal for me. I was a quiet guy, more into my books and video games than parties, so the idea of having my own space, a little sanctuary, was everything. The apartment itself wasn't much to look at. It was an old brick building on the west side of town, but the rent was cheap and it was close to campus. My unit was on the first floor, right above the basement, and it had this huge window that looked out onto an overgrown backyard. I remember feeling this rush of pure freedom the day I got the keys. It was a good feeling, one that didn't last long at all. That I moved in on a Tuesday, and by Friday night, the weirdness had already started. I was just settling in, unpacking some books and trying to get my internet to work when I heard it for the first time. At first, I thought maybe it was the upstairs neighbor, but the sound was coming from below me, and it was heavy. Like, seriously heavy. It sounded like someone was dragging a massive wooden wardrobe across a concrete floor, just slowly, deliberately, with this terrible scraping sound that vibrated right through the floorboards and into my bones. Then came the footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, heavy steps, and they sounded like someone was walking with boots made of lead. The floor of my living room literally hummed with the weight of it. It went on for maybe 15 minutes, then stopped dead, and I was left in this deafening silence, my heart pounding in my chest like a drum. I tried to tell myself it was just the building settling, or maybe some old plumbing, but a part of me knew that wasn't it. It felt too purposeful. That first night was rough. I barely slept, every creak and groan of the old building sending a jolt of adrenaline through me. The next morning, I decided I had to do something. I found my landlord's number on the lease and gave him a call. His name was Mr. Henderson, a really old guy with a voice that sounded like gravel grinding against gravel. He answered on the second ring, and I explained the situation, trying my best to sound casual, like this was a normal complaint. I told him about the dragging, the footsteps, all of it. He listened patiently, then there was a long pause. When he spoke again, his voice was different. It was colder, more serious. "Son," he said, "I don't know what you heard, but that basement's been locked up tight for over 15 years. The last person who went down there was the city inspector, and that was way before my time. There's nothing down there." He was so insistent, so firm, that it actually spooked me more than the sounds themselves that I tried to shake it off, telling myself he was just an old man who didn't want to deal with a new tenant's complaints. But the sounds came back every night, like clockwork. The dragging, the heavy steps. But then something new started. Muffled whispers. They were so low I couldn't make out the words. Just this low, sibilant murmur that seemed to fill the air. It was like a secret being told just on the other side of my floor. A conversation I wasn't meant to hear. It made my skin crawl. I tried sleeping with my headphones on, blasting music, anything to drown it out, but I could still feel the low-frequency vibrations of the whispers through the floorboards, a constant, unsettling thrum. My paranoia was starting to get the better of me. I started jumping at shadows and found myself constantly peeking out the peephole before I opened the door. It was a really bad feeling, this slow, creeping dread, and just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, it did. One morning, I woke up to a thin piece of folded paper slid under my front door. It was an odd detail, because the bottom of my door was flush with the floor, there was no gap at all. I bent down to pick it up, and my hand was shaking a little. I unfolded it, and the message was written in what looked like hurried, shaky handwriting, in pencil. It said, "Stop eating microwaved mac and cheese every night." My stomach dropped. I'd been eating that stuff for dinner every single night since I moved in. No one knew that. No one. I live alone. The walls in my unit are thin, sure, but not that thin. There's no way you could hear a microwave beep from the hallway, let alone what I was eating, but I was completely rattled. My mind went into overdrive, running through every possible scenario. I started to wonder if maybe the notes were coming from the neighbor upstairs, but I rarely saw them, and they seemed like a sweet old couple. I couldn't imagine them doing something so twisted. But the notes kept coming, each one more specific and terrifying than the last. "The shower was a little long tonight, wasn't it? Don't listen to that song again. It's not good to talk to your mother about that." The last one hit me the hardest. I'd had a private, emotional phone call with my mom the night before, talking about some personal stuff. No one could have heard that. It was impossible. The paranoia turned into a full-blown panic attack. I felt like I was being watched 24/7, like I was living in a glass box. I couldn't relax, I couldn't sleep, and every second of every day was filled with this suffocating dread. I started taping up the gap at the bottom of my door, but a new note still appeared every morning. It was like they were taunting me. That was the last straw for me. I had to do something, anything, to feel safe again. I figured the only way to get answers was to talk to the neighbors. I went to the apartment next to mine, but it was empty, and the one on the other side was a young couple who looked at me like I was insane when I asked if they heard anything. So I decided to try the downstairs neighbor, the one directly below me. I knocked on her door, and this older woman, maybe in her late 60s, answered. She had these eyes that were so clear and blue they seemed to glow, and she wore this strange, antique-looking silver necklace with a tiny key on it. She introduced herself as Martha. I explained the situation, told her about the notes and the sounds from the basement. She listened, her gaze unblinking. When I finished, she smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Honey," she said, her voice a low purr, "that basement has been sealed shut for years. What you're hearing is just the building settling. It's an old place." Her words were almost identical to what the landlord had said, which sent a fresh wave of chills down my spine. But then, as she was about to close the door, I noticed something. The doormat inside her apartment, right by the doorframe, was slightly out of place. It was covering a small, square section of the floorboards. It looked like a hidden hatch, like a small cellar door. I pointed at it, and my voice came out a whisper. "What's that?" I asked. Her smile vanished instantly. She didn't say anything, just stared at me with those unnerving blue eyes. The air between us went cold. Then, she slowly, deliberately, put her hand to the tiny key on her necklace, as if to make sure it was still there. "That's nothing, dear. Just a loose floorboard. You should probably go back inside. You look tired." I felt my blood run cold. The way she said it was a command, not a suggestion. I didn't press it. I thanked her, mumbled some excuse, and practically ran back to my apartment. I locked the door behind me and just stood there, leaning against it, my mind racing that I couldn't shake the image of that hatch. And the way she clutched that little key. It all fit together in this horrifying puzzle. It was a secret entrance to the basement. And if she had a way in, maybe the sounds weren't a figment of my imagination after all. But that didn't explain the notes. I went back over every message, every single detail, and something just didn't add up. The notes knew about my private phone call with my mom. No one in the building could have heard that, not even Martha. I remember the call was late at night, and I was speaking in a low voice. The details were too specific, too intimate. It was as if someone wasn't just hearing me, but was inside my apartment, watching me. I couldn't shake the thought. The notes weren't coming from the basement or from Martha. They were coming from inside my own unit. The thought was so terrifying I felt physically ill. The thought that someone could be hiding in my apartment, that I spent the next 2 days in a state of hypervigilance, barely sleeping, jumping at every single sound. I started leaving my TV on, the volume high, just to drown out the silence. I was barely eating, just surviving on coffee and adrenaline. The notes kept coming, each one more personal and frightening than the last. The coffee grounds are still in the sink. You forgot to close the blinds tonight. The paranoia was a living thing, a shadow that followed me everywhere I went. One night, I was sitting on my couch, my laptop open, when I heard a distinct scraping sound from the wall behind me. Not from the floor, but the wall. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs. It sounded like something was being dragged across the plaster on the other side. My mind immediately went to the wall that I shared with the empty apartment next door. The sounds were different from what I heard in the basement, but they were still heavy, still slow. The thought of something being in the empty apartment, and what could be behind that wall, sent a cold spike of fear through me that I decided I had to confront Martha again. The hatch, the key, I couldn't ignore it. I had to know what she was hiding. I went down and knocked on her door. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. I tried the doorknob. It was unlocked. A wave of dread washed over me, but I felt like I had to go in. I slowly pushed the door open and stepped inside. The apartment was pristine, almost sterile. There was an old-fashioned phonograph in the corner and a single, faded black and white photo on a mantelpiece. It was a picture of a young man, handsome, with eyes that were as blue as Martha's, and he was smiling. As I walked further into the living room, I noticed it again. The doormat was still covering the same spot. I walked over and cautiously lifted the mat. There it was, a small, wooden hatch with a tiny keyhole. It was exactly like the one on Martha's necklace. The mystery of the key was solved, but the others were just beginning. I knelt down and pulled on the hatch, but it was locked. I heard a faint sound behind me and spun around. Martha was standing in the doorway, holding a grocery bag. Her face was expressionless, her eyes cold and hard as chips of ice. She wasn't smiling. "What are you doing here, dear?" she asked. Her voice was flat, devoid of any warmth. I stammered, trying to come up with a lie, but she just kept staring at me with those cold, unwavering eyes. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. I had a feeling that I was in a lot of trouble. My mind raced, but I couldn't think of an escape. I felt trapped, cornered. The sounds, the notes, the locked basement, the key, the secretive neighbor, it was all coming to a head, and I had a feeling that I was about to find out the truth, and that I wasn't going to like it one bit. Just as I was about to turn and run, my eyes caught a small, framed photo on a side table. It was a picture of a younger Martha, maybe in her 20s, standing beside the same young man from the other photo. But there was something else in the picture. The background was the basement. I could clearly see the concrete walls and the huge boiler in the corner. The young man was pointing at something on the wall, something I couldn't make out. But what really made my blood run cold was the small, almost unnoticeable detail. The wall behind them was covered in what looked like scribbled messages. The same kind of hurried, shaky handwriting from the notes I had been getting. My stomach twisted into a knot. I knew then that Martha and the notes were connected, but the presence of the young man confused me. Who was he? And why was he in the basement with her? Why was the basement filled with these messages? I looked back at Martha, and her face was a mask of cold fury. She saw me looking at the photo. "Get out," she said, her voice a low growl. Now, I didn't need to be told twice. I scrambled to my feet and ran out of her apartment, not even bothering to close the door behind me. I didn't stop until I was inside my own unit. The door locked and bolted behind me. I felt like I had just escaped from a lion's den. I finally understood. The sounds, the whispers, the notes, it was all tied to Martha. But the notes were still a mystery. I sat on my couch, shaking, trying to process everything. The young man in the photo, the scribbles on the wall, the notes, it all too much. I had to get out. I couldn't stay there another minute. I started packing my bags, my hands shaking so badly I could barely zip up the zipper. My phone buzzed, a text from my mom. I didn't even look at it. I just wanted to leave, to get as far away from that place as possible. Then I heard it. A single, rhythmic knock on my front door. My heart leapt into my throat. I backed away, my eyes glued to the door. "Hello," a woman's voice called out from the other side. "I'm the new tenant from upstairs. I just wanted to introduce myself." It was the neighbor from above, the one I had so casually dismissed. I didn't say anything, didn't move. I just stood there, waiting. She knocked again. Then, after a long pause, she spoke again. "I heard you've been having some trouble with Martha." I froze. She can be difficult. The way she said it was unnerving. But don't worry. I've been here a long time. I know what's going on. I felt a shiver run down my spine. The notes, the sounds, the neighbor upstairs. It all came back to her. The notes were always slid under my door. The person who wrote them would have to be in the hallway. My neighbor was in the hallway, right outside my door. It was so simple, so obvious, and so horrifying. The whispers I heard from the basement. Were they from two people? I opened the door, and there she was, a woman in her 40s with a kind smile. But her eyes held a strange glint. "You came to the right place," she said, her voice a low murmur. "I know everything." She held a small piece of folded paper in her hand. "This is for you." I took it, my hand trembling. I unfolded it, and the message was written in the same familiar handwriting. "You talked to the upstairs neighbor." That was a mistake. My blood ran cold. I looked up at the woman, my mind reeling. She smiled, but it was a chilling, predatory smile. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she said, her voice a soft, malicious whisper. "I've been watching you." I slammed the door shut, locking it with a trembling hand, and slid to the floor, my mind a blank slate of pure terror. The notes, the sounds, the whispers, they were from both of them. They were partners. The young man in the photo was probably their son, trapped in the basement. It all fit. The house wasn't just haunted, it was filled with two people with a dark and disturbing secret. I didn't stay to find out what it was. I packed my bags and left, and never looked back. I didn't care about my deposit, I didn't care about the rent. I just wanted to get out. I called my parents and told them I was coming home. They were worried sick, but I didn't explain everything. I couldn't. I just told them I was having a bad week. I ended up moving in with them for a few months, and then I found a new place, a small, modern apartment in a new part of town. I haven't been back to that old building since. I don't know what happened to Martha, or to the neighbor upstairs, or to the young man in the basement. But I do know one thing. I will never, ever rent a place with a basement again. I can still hear the whispers and the dragging sounds in my sleep, and every time I see a folded piece of paper on the ground, I get a shiver down my spine. I think I'll be looking over my shoulder for the rest of my life.